Good afternoon, cybersecurity enthusiasts. My name is Boyden Rohner, and I'm joined here today with my colleague Tom Ruoff, and we work in the cybersecurity division at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. If you're not familiar with CISA, we are the newest component of the Department of Homeland Security, and we serve as the nation's risk advisor. We are responsible for understanding cyber and physical risks to the nation's critical infrastructure and providing risk advice to help our partners build their own capabilities, which in turn strengthens national resilience. Specifically, Tom and I work on cyber vulnerability management portfolio. This means we work to understand vulnerabilities and devise strategies to manage them. So naturally, we are obsessive about learning the latest information about vulnerabilities threat actors are exploiting in the nation's critical infrastructure. Over the course of the last couple of years, we've uncovered some new trends in vulnerabilities, and today it's our goal to share with you what we've learned, what we plan to do about it, and how you can help. We're going to be answering questions all throughout this presentation via the chat. So if you've got a question for us, head on over to the chat and we'll respond there. To get us started, I want to take us back to my 6th grade science project. For my science project, I studied icebergs. If you aren't familiar with icebergs, they are composed of fresh water, which is less dense than salty seawater. And so thanks to Archimedes' principle of buoyancy, only a fraction of the iceberg is above water and visible to the human eye. Over the past couple of years, as we've spoken to security researchers, done our own analysis, and responded to incidents across the country, we have come to the conclusion that software presents an illusion similar to an iceberg. What you might be getting is more than what meets the eye. In cybersecurity, we spend the majority of our time observing, analyzing, and responding to vulnerabilities in operating systems and at the application layer. And yet, there are categories of vulnerabilities lurking beneath the proverbial surface that we aren't dealing with. Through our vulnerability research efforts and our incident response activities, we have come to realize there are vulnerabilities below the operating system, a term we're coining here today, VBOS, that we must deal with too. If you're like me and Tom, and you work in the vulnerability management space of cybersecurity, you're probably thinking to yourselves, oh, please no, not more vulnerabilities, CISA. US CERT already texts me every day about something critical to fix. Well, this is a quick plug that if you're not getting those texts every day from US CERT telling you what to fix, to head on over to the US CERT or CISA website right now and sign up for those alerts. They'll change your life. But if you're starting to think about a career change because you've only been dealing with the tip of the vulnerability iceberg, don't get discouraged, because we think that some of the work that's already been done on software bill of materials, that initiative can be the answer. For the uninitiated, software bill of materials, or SBOM, is effectively a nested inventory, a list of ingredients that makes up software components. So before we get ahead of ourselves and get to the solution, let's talk about the problem. I'm going to turn it over to Tom to help us define the problem. Tom?
Thank you, Boyden. So carrying on with the analogy of the iceberg, and by the way, I did read Boyden's 6th grade report on icebergs. It's fascinating. And I recommend it to those who can find it online. But for those who can't, what I would suggest is that you take a look at some of the material that we're going to be putting out shortly. And this taxonomy and the reports we've put out will be probably, although probably not as interesting, but a little more germane to the topic. So what we've done is we've taken the concept of the vulnerability or the material below the operating system, and of course that software which links the hardware back to the operating system. And it's those specialty areas of code, which is the focus of our work in the past, and we're again talking about here today. And so if we think about the graphic here, and again the details we've gone into in our reports, for the techies out there, think about this as our Rosetta Stone. We had to organize our thoughts as to what resides in the software and the organization construct of that. And this is how we see the world in terms of the software that's accessible to the users. That's the operating system, the applications, and the data. And that which connects the operating system and the applications to the hardware, again, the firmware. So we're concerned with this realm, and how we organize it was actually very crafty. And my hat's off to our partners at Eclipsium and NEIS who helped us with this decomposition. And again, there's many views of this topic area, but we chose this one because we think it captures and bundles some of these topics uniquely. But before we get into the depths of the topic area, we'd like to go through just a couple of examples of exploits. Boyden?
Perfect. Yes. So the first example illustrating a vulnerability below the operating system attack is the infamous attack on the Ukrainian power grid from December 2015. Attackers installed malicious firmware on the serial to Ethernet gateway devices so that in the event that the power companies could recover operator workstations, remote commands would not be able to bring those substations back online. The second example of an attack on a vulnerability below the operating system, or VBOS, happened in 2018. A threat actor created a UEFI rootkit called LoJax that affected the legitimate anti-theft software called LoJack, which is used as a UEFI BIOS module to survive an operating system reinstallation or replacement of the hard drive. As a refresher, in that attack, a rootkit dropper arrived via just standard phishing vector via an attachment or a link, and then the adversaries established a command and control channel to download a second stage malware, including a UEFI rootkit that provided persistence and remote access to the software. Tom?
Thank you. Let's take a little bit of time here and talk about the problem, the size of the problem, and some of the details of the problem. So this next section of the talk is going to be a decomposition of our thoughts about why we think it's a problem, the details of the problem, and then, in fact, problem definition. So what we've shown here is kind of our beginning thoughts. And what we do see is, although the percentage of the overall vulnerabilities identified per year is low, we're seeing a growth trend. And in particular, we see the noticeable increase in the activity and frequency associated with incidents. And we asked ourselves, well, why? Well, we think this is kind of the starter because the actor set that is currently exploiting these vulnerabilities are using kits that were created by nation-state actors several years ago. Of course, you can't keep some of the best kits you can't keep them out of the market, and so they become popularized. As a consequence, what used to be in the realm of the nation-state actors have now become in the realm of the commercial actors, and as a consequence, we're beginning to see an uptick in those, therefore, the interest in the vulnerability space. Now, this doesn't mean that because they had the rootkits, that was the sole cause. Of course, it's the persistence and the difficulty of detecting any of these attacks that are down below the vulnerability, down below the operating system. And as Boyden pointed out, in the case of the Ukrainian exercise, they were crafty enough to be able to open the circuit breakers, but then they burnt the bridge back when they installed that malware with the serial kits, the serial gateways, because it didn't allow for remote access. Really smart idea. Well, okay. Well, what this means is it's really difficult to be able to recover from, and the persistence is what seems to be the motivation factor here. Now, let's get a little more deep into the details here then. So let's start with the good news story. The good news story is that we see that in above the OS, there's an increasing use of vulnerability mitigation techniques. And those are the five that are listed on the right. Well, that's great, right? So now we're seeing code that inherently is becoming stronger or less risky because we're seeing vulnerability mitigation techniques employed, and they're on the upkeep. Yay, that's great. That's That's probably the good news story, or that's the good part of the good news story. The bad news story is we look at the focus of these, and if we go back and say, well, what's the percentage of successful implementation commercial products? DEP, the data execution prevention techniques, they're almost at 90%, almost at 90% of the address space layout randomization. That's really good. But as we see then the mitigation of those vulnerabilities across the 10 or so capabilities we've got here, actually 9, what we're seeing is that they're really focused percentage-wise on the first 4. Well, that's again a good news story that there are mitigations being taken place. The bad news is they're not. They're focused and they're not spread across the spectrum. Well, okay, but we're seeing an uptick, and we're seeing an uptick in this, and that's good. Now, the bad news is that all of those vulnerability mitigation techniques we saw before in the earlier slide, they're not applicable to a great deal of the areas we've been talking about here, in particular the UEFI. And so what this means is that although this is good that we're trying to write better code and close vulnerabilities, the bad news is that the techniques aren't applicable. Okay, so we have some work to do. Again, the more bad news, as we spoke earlier, is that the bad guys seem to be concentrating on the UEFI as an area of interest, predominantly because of what the role it plays. But even the worst is, and this gets kind of tricky here, and that is that we got to be thinking about the work that needs to be done to be able to bring in vulnerability mitigation techniques, because today, unfortunately, the vendors are disabling the security mechanisms by default. And the reason for that is because they don't feel it's important, or they don't feel it's an operational capability they want to put into play, that it may chew up some of the cycle time. But we need the cooperation of the developers and integrators to install capability implicitly that's enabled, like the NX. And so again, the NX is just an example of this. And this means there's insufficient cooperation with the vendors in this area, and we have to turn that around. So in turning it around, we're hoping that this talk will encourage those to get others. This is the conclusion of that part of the talk where we talk about why we're enthusiastic in our areas. And I'm going to turn it over to Boyden to talk about what this means and where we think we're going.
Thanks, Tom. All that talk about bad, really bad, and worst leads us back to our title slide. If you came to our talk hoping to see vendors named and shamed as the worst offenders, I'm afraid we're going to disappoint you, because that's not what this is about. Instead, we're positing that the UEFI is the worst offender in terms of vulnerability management. The core nature of UEFI, its ubiquity, and its lack of memory protection enforcements leads us to the conclusion that as it is done today, it is the worst offender below the operating system. By making this bold claim, our goal is to draw attention to the issue that the software mitigations that are applied above the operating system need to expand to encompass the vulnerabilities that are below the operating system as well, especially the UEFI. In order to understand how we're going to get ourselves as a community out of this conundrum, we're going to turn our eyes towards food. Enter the often used Twinkie analogy. Someone gives you a Twinkie. You read the label, you see the ingredients. Curiously, most of them are unpronounceable. What do? You want to make a decision based on your risk tolerance. For example, if you're Tom, you might think, FDA has done the testing and they call this human food. I haven't read the lab reports, but I'm okay with assuming the risk of eating one of these Twinkies once in a while.
Well, on the other hand, no matter how much FDA testing is going on and how many reports are out there, there's no way that we're going to convince Boyden to be eating a Twinkie and make that risk decision. Just not going to happen.
That's right. But we digress. Imagine a world where the contents of the stuff we eat is not labeled. No USD food grade, no list of contents. folks would be confusing dog food with human food and ingesting risky content. But thanks to the FDA, we have food labels that disclose ingredients, and testing can differentiate between human food and dog food. Disclosing ingredients through labels is a great start, but unless you read the testing reports that describe the attributes of those unpronounceable ingredients on that Twinkie label, you are still only making a partially informed risk decision. For example, would you eat a Twinkie if the label said it could kill you, like the label says on cigarettes? Now, think about that when it comes to the IT and OT devices that you purchase. Do you know what's in it? Do you know what code you're inheriting? What is the lab report detailing the effects of the software that you might have in your system, say? Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Boyden. Well, with every project, you really need to get a clear, defined, and comprehensive problem statement. And it took us a while as we were noodling through here to get to that, but we think this is what we arrived at. So in a nutshell, we think the problem is that IT and OT systems are being compromised by vulnerable software that we don't have visibility into, by actors using commercially available tools that exploit the software that we have few mitigation capabilities to address. And as a consequence of that, we really think that we want to start with and begin our exploration of success or getting better with addressing the UEFI code. And again, the majority of the issues we're concerned about, not all, are focused at the UEFI. And as a consequence, that's really our starting point. And so we want to talk to you now about what success looks like from the CISA viewpoint. So first, we think that and we've talked about the SBOM, but we think the idea of the SBOM, which is great, is a good place to begin and is addressed in the executive order. So I would strongly encourage people who have not to read the executive order, particularly those sections dealing with the SBOM. Now, getting the SBOM components is great, and it's how we get the ingredients, but it's a necessary, but really not a sufficient condition to make those risk-based decisions. And we'll go through what is required as well. So, but once you get the ingredients, you need to understand what the ingredients are supposed to do in terms of those behaviors. So again, we want the disclosure of what the ingredients are, and we'd also like the manufacturers to tell us what it's supposed to do. And by the same token, that gives us a constraint layer. So we know that the SBOM is moving along, but we want to be able to tag it along to something else, which again is what the manufacturers think it's going to do. So, Boyden?
Secondly, we want the community to adopt vulnerability mitigations for all software with a special focus on software below the operating system and UEFI code. Just as the FDA recognizes Twinkies as food, we want VBOS to be recognized as vulnerabilities. There are tools and techniques that can apply, and together we need to ask for adoption of those across the code base, because neglecting vulnerabilities below the operating system leaves the adversaries a playground that we can't afford.
Third, and progressing along, we think that the capability to understand what the software can do, and what it is capable of doing, we need to be able to put together. And we're realistic. We understand that not all code can be examined in detail. This is really tough. And so we're not asking to boil the ocean. We're thinking, what is the first set of teacups that we can start taking our Bic lighter and warming up? So we want to start with software and devices that are fairly well constrained or purpose built. Like PLCs and medical devices is a good start. Those are not general purpose devices, and we know that the software that's built to them was built specifically to exhibit a limited number of behavior. So let's remember that UEFI, the firmware, the BIOS, should be able to do a defined set of behaviors, like establishing external connections or altering memory locations sometimes, but not as a general course of behavior. And as a consequence, we need to be able to do the software analysis to be able to determine what the software is capable of doing. Now, again, like I talked about initially, we're not trying to boil the ocean, and we know this is hard, But we think if we start in a constrained environment area, let's define our problem set, that we're going to be able to start making progress. And we think that these purpose-built devices and how we would examine those at scale to determine capable behavior is a real good place to start. So what do we want next? Well, the challenge in this next activity is trying to get some sort of a high-level risk indicator or an indicator scoring. And I know the word scoring is going to cause a lot of problems, but if we think about what about a risk indicator index, but we wanted to go out on a limb and talk about a scoring because we think that being ambitious and putting that marker ahead would motivate the community to do so. And in this case, we think the challenge is coupling the SBOM, the designer notes, that's what the manufacturer's telling us it should do, the software capabilities test and determine the difference between the intent and the capability at scale. So, for example, we know that if we're able to determine if the software vendor says that the device should exhibit 5 behaviors, say, and we think that those 5 behaviors are well articulated, and now if we test against it and we determine that the behaviors it can exhibit are 4, well, okay, as long as it's the same 4 of the 5, then that's not a risk, it's just a poor product, okay? So it said it's supposed to do 5, it does 4, okay, it's got an incomplete feature set. Not a problem from our view. Then let's take an example where the product manufacturer says it's supposed to have 5 behaviors and it exhibits the same 5 behaviors regardless of the input. That's good code. That's the classic definition of good code. Well, now let's take the other end of the spectrum where that same manufacturer says it's supposed to do 5 behaviors, and we look at the capability, both probably statically and perhaps dynamically in certain rare cases, and we find it can do, say, 25 of those behaviors. Wait a minute, 5 is what's supposed to do, and yet it can exhibit 25. What other 20 is it doing that we, manufacturer, didn't expect to do, nor we as the consumer? Well, we think that's where we start to look at how we can think about those as a risk indicator scoring algorithm. Behavior that it was not intended to do, yet is capable of doing. And again, you know, we're being realistic, but we also understand this is really hard. And so as we get our ambitions together and we look at the research we're doing, we want to be able to start again in that constrained area. Boyden.
Well, the devil is in the details. So everybody wants to see the details. We need to have readily available detailed test reports to substantiate indicators of risk at scale. These need to be available to whomever needs to access them. The risk indicators need to be backed up with test data to provide integrity and make risk decisions data-driven, moving us as a community from hope to knowledge. And finally, we are advocating promoting policies that discourage the procurement of the worst offenders of vulnerabilities below the operating system. We want policy that helps consumers make risk-informed decisions. Buying a product with lots of code with risk indicators is not a bad move if it's a conscious decision, but if you take the same action out of a place of ignorance, that's what we want to change. So Tom, why don't we do a role play to illustrate these points?
Sure, Boyden. So let's pretend you're a CIO or CISO and you're trying to make a risk-based decision about what product to buy. What questions would you be asking?
Well, first I'd be saying, show me the software bill of materials. Can you provide that to me? Secondly, I might be asking, can you tell me what the software is intended to do? And finally, I'd probably be asking, what vulnerability mitigation techniques have been included in the software?
Well, those are great questions. So what do you do, Boyden, if you can't get answers to those?
Well, if you still have to make a decision, then you're probably making a faith-based decision and not a risk-based one.
Oh, well, we know that nobody wants to be doing that. And as cybersecurity professionals, we ought to be making risk-based, data-driven decisions. So let's now talk about what CISA can do to create this paradigm shift.
Absolutely. First, as the nation's risk advisor, CISA sits at the cross-section of all 16 critical infrastructure sectors industry, and government, and we use our unique vantage point to make sense of the risks facing our country. Therefore, we can do our part to convene the community. We're reaching out to the public, yes, you audience members, to try and get your ideas and solicit your support. We're especially interested in getting the vendor and the UEFI coding community involved so that we can put a strategy in place that works for everybody. In fact, if you're really eager to get interested, you can head on over to NTIA's website right now and check out NTIA/SBOM and get information about SBOM and how you can join the next virtual multi-stakeholder meeting. Second, CISA can continue to evolve our services to help our critical infrastructure owners and operators get the visibility they need to make risk-based decisions. In turn, that brings CISA information. CISA brings back information to CISA to help us make a better judgment about the risk posture to the nation and advocate for better practices. Finally, CISA can work with researchers to develop automated code analysis to verify vendor code claims and explore getting risk scores. Tom, you want to tell people how to get involved?
Absolutely. Well, first off, go read the executive order. A lot of work went into that and a lot of great thought. And we think that there's content in there that is applicable to everybody. So read it and then do some Googling to find out about efforts to implement the EO sections and about SBOM and what that means to you. Because this is pretty revolutionary. And again, a lot of people have spent a lot of number of years getting that piece of work put together. Second, get smart on SBOM and make it a practice to require SBOM in all your procurements. So make it personal, make it real. And when you're making an IT purchase, specifically, ask if there's any CVEs related to the product and how the manufacturers address those. Further, you can ask what vulnerability mitigation techniques have been applied to the software. As we talked about before, there are those 4 that are in great use above, and now we want to be able to get that done below. So if you want to look really, really smart, ask what are the vulnerability mitigation techniques that have been applied in the code at the UEFI layer. If you really, really want to be an informed and proactive consumer, ask for the designer notes from your manufacturer. Ask, what is this code? What is it supposed to do? And is there any testing reports to tell me the differences between what it can do and what it can't? Last, start implementing compensating controls around devices with vulnerabilities below the operating system until you get a sense that you can replace or mitigate them. And again, this is just grand old common sense systems engineering cybersecurity practices. So again, until we get the controls we want in place as we've listed before, think about what vulnerabilities you're able to find out in your systems or systems that you're about to acquire, and putting those compensating controls using, again, systems engineering cybersecurity techniques. Boyden?
Thank you, Tom. Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. We hope that we've whetted your appetite to learn more about vulnerabilities below the operating system and get involved. If you want to continue to work with us, please go to the CISA website or go check out NTA/SBOM and register your thoughts, your feedback, and your comments. We look forward to working with you to defend today and secure tomorrow. Take care.